Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours as well. So this week, I'm going to give out a fairly lengthy facepalm and sigh award. It's going to take quite a bit of time to go through, and I'll do not just one, but actually two Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy segments, so maybe that's something you can be thankful for this Thanksgiving, that I'm going to do two Calvin and Hobbes segments. Well, I'm thankful for it because I really love those. And I'm also going to go ahead and relay some of the feedback that I've been getting on the podcast, because I always do love it when people write in and say, oh, I really liked your point here, or no, let me push back. That's one of the funnest parts of doing this podcast, is actually having discussions with people. That's why I try to get guests on the podcast so often. So it's a whole podcast of just segments this time. I don't have one particular main focus, so I'll be covering a lot of different ground, and I hope this is something you enjoy. So first up, here's the Facepalm and Sigh Award that I'm giving out this week. And again, it's no longer the Facepalm and Sigh Award of the Week, because I'm not doing it weekly, even though I think I'm now going on 3 or 4 weeks in a row this time. Anyhow, this week I'm going to give it out to the Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg for some comments he made on abortion on a podcast. And I managed to find the clip of him speaking so you can hear him in his own words.
Now, right now, they hold everybody in line with this one piece of doctrine about abortion, right? Which is obviously a tough issue for a lot of people to think through morally. Then again, there's a lot of parts of the Bible that talk about how life begins with breath. And so even that is something that we can interpret differently. And
I'm pro-choice.
Take up, me too.
Yeah.
But I think no matter where you think about the kind of cosmic question of how life begins, most Americans can get on the board with the idea of, all right, I might draw the line here, you might draw the line there, but the most important thing is the person who should be drawing the line is the woman making the decision.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what Buttigieg said here is a proverbial goldmine of problems and fallacies. I could probably do an entire podcast in and of itself just dissecting everything that's wrong here. He's guilty of straw manning. He's guilty of cherry picking. He's guilty of not recognizing all the numerous, very problematic implications of what he's talking about. He's very susceptible to reductio ad absurdum in what he claimed there. So let's just start with trying to construct a charitable argument as to what he seems to be saying there. He seems to be saying, well, the Bible, at least one possible way to interpret the Bible is that it says life begins at breath, therefore abortion would be acceptable up to the moment when the infant takes its first breath. Or you could take him as saying that because there are multiple reasonable and valid interpretations of the Bible as far as when life begins, that's not a good source to go to for determining when life begins. And then the last part he says about the most important thing is who should decide where that line is as far as where life begins. Well, he doesn't really give an argument for that. He just kind of asserts it and then bases it on the fact that he thinks most everyone will agree with him, which is straight up an ad populum fallacy. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that most people in America do agree with him that the most important thing is who gets to decide where that line is, where life begins. Well, that doesn't make it so. That doesn't actually make it the most important thing. That's an obvious ad populum fallacy there. But let's go back to his first claim that there's multiple varying interpretations of the Bible. This is something that is often claimed, especially by people who are, Buttigieg claims to be a faithful Christian Episcopalian, so he's not claiming to be a secular person, but you usually hear claims like this from secular people that the Bible's full of contradictions, multiple possible interpretations, and things along those lines. And usually that just kind of goes unchallenged, at least in the popular press and media, and I would want to push back there and say, no, you don't get to just make that claim flat out like this. I get why the podcast host didn't challenge him on this, because biblical illiteracy is rampant in our culture, and most people have just heard the Bible's full of multiple interpretations and contradictions, and they just take it at face value. Well, I'd want to immediately push back on him and say, no. If you're telling me there's multiple valid interpretations like this, you have to demonstrate that to me. You just made the claim that the Bible has multiple valid interpretations and or has contradictions. You have the burden of proof to show that. You don't just get to assume that like he is. And then on top of that, I would push back on him a little bit and say, but you're also not talking about like competing theological systems. Like I've had people on this podcast advocate for open theism, Molinism, the Thomistic answer to the problem of divine foreknowledge, and Reformed or Calvinist positions. And those are competing theological systems, theological viewpoints where I think reasonable people could agree you can find support for each one of those, at least somewhat, in Scripture. He's not talking about something like that. He's talking about one specific claim, which is, well, when does life begin? When did Phil Kallberg's life begin? Was it the moment of his conception? Was it somewhere along in his mother's womb? Was it the moment of his birth? And that's an entirely different claim than saying, well, should you be an Episcopalian or a Presbyterian? Should you be a Baptist or a Pentecostal? Or should you be some mix there all live in? In many senses, when people make a claim like this, and I don't know if Buttigieg is doing this because he didn't speak in very big specifics, but many times when people make a claim like that, oh, the Bible's vague and you can interpret it in many ways, what they're doing is they're conflating things where, well, yeah, it's not really clear in Scripture what the answer to the problem of divine foreknowledge is. It's not really clear in Scripture what God's relation to time is. That's not things that the Bible addresses. But they're conflating things like that with questions that are very, very, very clear and obvious. And Scripture's stance on the status of the person in the womb, or the baby in the womb, the fetus, is really, really remarkably clear and consistent. Now, it doesn't give a scientific definition. You won't find a verse that says, and life begins at conception, because the Bible's not written as a scientific or philosophical textbook, as I've talked with many people on this podcast about. Rather, it's written in what was for its time contemporary, ordinary language, so it's not going to say things like that. It's not going to be as precise as somebody who's a philosopher like me would like. But if you actually read Scripture as a whole, you find it places an immense high amount of value on the unborn and children. Christ says things in the Gospels like, whoever, if you did anything to one of the littlest of these, cause one of them to stumble or go astray, it'd be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and you to be tossed into the sea. Jeremiah 1:5 says, before I formed you in your womb, I knew you. Before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you and made a prophet unto you. Made you a prophet. And that's speaking specifically of Jeremiah, but you can clearly see God saying, no, you didn't begin your life at birth. You began your life even before you were a formed human being in the womb, which strongly implies, if it's appropriate to say life begins anywhere, it would begin at conception, according to the Scripture. You find other examples in the Old Testament where if there's a fight going on and a pregnant woman gets hit and the baby or fetus dies, people have to pay compensation for that. Similarly to how they would have to pay compensation for accidental deaths of actual human beings. It's treated something like manslaughter would be nowadays. And the best way to interpret anybody or anything, whether it's the Scripture, another book, or another person, is try and look at the whole of what they say and make sense of it. Especially when you're talking about people. People make foolish, dumb statements all the time. I've made more than a few of mine, and now you've got over 50 hours of recording. I'm sure you can go back through and find me saying something really stupid on this podcast because I'm a human being. Well, the most charitable thing to do and the best thing to do, if you want to know what I think about things, is don't go through in mine and find one quote where I said something stupid. Listen to all of it and try and mesh it together, and you'll get a good sense of what I think. And that's what you actually need to do with Scripture as well. And Buttigieg is quite clearly not doing that and trying to make excuses for why he doesn't have to do that. And now, if you're a little more skeptically minded, I'm sure you might want to chime in and say, wait, but Phil, isn't this what you're doing to Pete Buttigieg? You're taking a 1, maybe 2 minute clip of him saying stuff where he's not really clear and you're pulling and digging all this stuff out of it. And if this was the only time he'd ever talked about abortion in any way at all, I'd say, very good point. But it's not. He's actually been remarkably consistent on towing the pro-life party line of the Democrats the pro-choice party line as far as the Democrats take on abortion. So in this case, I think there's a pretty clear pattern he's established as to, yes, he's very, very much in favor of a strong pro-choice stance on abortion, and we're just trying to figure out how he justifies it, and that's where he's been a bit unclear. So, hey, if people actually do press him more on this and he changes his tune or he comes out with better reasoning, I'll be happy to make a note of that in future podcasts, although I'm running a philosophy podcast here, not like a journalistic organization. If you're turning into me to be informed about politics and what's going on in the world, you've got a real problem. You shouldn't do that. I'm here to give you philosophy and the logic, not be a journalist. So that's why I'm not guilty of just quote mining Pete Buttigieg, because he's been very, very consistent on this as best as I can tell. But hey, if he changes his tune, great. I'll make a note of that and readjust my criticism as necessary if he actually does. And furthermore, his position that he articulated, which is, hey, breath gives life, or at least that's what he seems to be saying, is, well, it's very susceptible to reductio ad absurdum. So does this mean that if somebody has to be on a ventilator in a hospital where they don't have their own breath, that they're dead? Now, obviously, you can die if you're not breathing, but there's also ways you can keep alive. I forget the exact name of it, but there's an amazing system that sometimes is used for very, very deep sea diving, where people are actually suspended in an oxygenated liquid that enters their lungs, and that actually pumps oxygen into their lungs. So and these people aren't really technically, when they do this, breathing in really any sense at all, because their lungs are full of this liquid now they're getting the oxygen they need from that. So, according to Buttigieg, would those people no longer be alive? And even more importantly, if we take breath in a little bit more of a scientific sense here, which is you're getting oxygen, the baby or fetus is getting oxygen from the moment of its conception, that it's in its mother's womb. It's getting it through its mother's lungs and bloodstream, so that doesn't work either. And so I read somewhere about Buttigieg that part of what he was doing here was attempting to respond to accusations that he cherry picks from the Bible. And he's saying, no, I don't do this. But this is a very, very clear example of him cherry picking, where he's apparently attempting to appeal to the verse in Genesis that says God breathed life into Adam, and some other ones that equate life with the breath of God. And he's ignoring all these other examples. And that's pretty much the definition of cherry picking. You can't go with the ones you like and ignore the other ones you don't, which is exactly what he says he's doing. You've got to consider them all at once and do the best job you can with that. And another fallacy he's engaging in here is he's flat out strawmanning the people who are against abortion. Go back and listen to the episode I did on abortion, if you like. It's episode number 15, Abortion and Arguing from the Extremes. Now, I think the abortion part of it is only probably about 30 or 40 minutes. I did some other stuff on the beginning and end of that one. But at no point in that episode, where I gave about 3 or 4 arguments against abortion that I think are pretty strong, at no point did I appeal to the Bible, Scripture, or any type of theology. It was all straight-up philosophy that I was appealing to. So sure, if you look around, you'll probably find some people who make arguments against abortion from the Bible and theology, but the vast majority of people who I know who are staunch pro-life activists don't do that. They rather try to be as inclusive as possible, and so even though they think they could appeal to Scripture to support don't murder your babies, even if they're in the womb, they don't do that because they're trying to appeal to as broad a segment of people as possible. And continuing on with this strawman fallacy, I don't know if he's doing this on purpose or if he just clearly does not understand what pro-life people say, but it's not at all agreed upon that the most important question is who gets to decide where that line is as far as life begins. Because if life begins at conception, or if it's not even appropriate to say that life begins, as one philosopher friend of mine said, there's no point at which life begins because it never ends. It's not like the sperm and egg die when they come together. It's just that before that, the sperm was a part of the father's body, the egg was a part of the mother's body, and then when they come together, they form a new person. Life is continuous. So when Buttigieg says, well, whatever you take on that, the most important thing is who says when it is, no, absolutely not. The most important thing is when it happens, if it happens at all, because if it happens at conception, or life is continuous, then nobody should ever get to decide when it's okay to kill a baby. Because it's never going to be okay to kill a baby. So in his example here, and again, he didn't really give a clear argument, so he just kind of asserted this, but you could say perhaps maybe he's falling into a bit of begging the question. He's simply assuming the choice is what's the most important thing, therefore we have to figure out who has the choice. Where, as far as I know, the best pro-life arguments that there are, given by most pro-life advocates, simply reject that and say the choice is a secondary consideration to whether or not there actually is life here. And if there is real human life here, then nobody should get to make that choice. Just the same as I know people who in my life who are human beings who annoy me are real human beings, so I don't get to kill them just because they annoy and inconvenience me. That'd be horrifically evil. And there's one further thought I had with this, which is if Pete Buttigieg is more or less attempting to appeal to the story in Genesis where God breathed life into Adam, and that's when the first human life began, well, then he's making a philosophical error of confusing the ad hoc, the exceptional, the one with the normative. That is, there's all kinds of things in history which are one-time events that are not normative. The resurrection of Christ is a one-time event. It's not normative. World War II is a one-time event. It's not normative. You shouldn't look back on these historic events and then say, aha, we have to act as if this is happening all the time. That's foolishness, and we all know that. Well, that's kind of what he's doing if that's what he's appealing to. But it's even worse than that. Now, I don't know what Pete Buttigieg's views on evolution, science, and creation are. I'm not aware that he's been interviewed on them. But given the fact that he's running for president as a Democrat and claims to be a faithful Episcopalian, I would bet you he's some type of theistic evolutionist. Obviously, you can't really be a Christian without believing in God, and the fact that he's running as a Democrat suggests to me he's not skeptical of evolution, so he's some type of theistic evolutionist. Well, then he's got a problem, because most reasonable interpretations of theistic evolution say that mankind evolved and then at some point God did something special, or human beings gradually gained the image of God within them, something along those lines. Point being that most types of theistic evolution don't really say that God literally breathed breath into Adam. So then where is Buttigieg's basis for claiming that's where the breath of life comes? Oh, and I guess I should add here, the exception being the variant of theistic evolution that Michael Jones espoused when I had him as a guest a while back, because he actually does really think that there was a real Adam and Eve, and God really did do something like that. Although I guess I didn't ask him if he thought Adam's body had evolved prior to that or whatnot, but still, I'd say Michael Jones is probably immune from that type of criticism because he actually thinks there was a real Adam and Eve and does believe in evolution. So, let's count them up here. Pete Buttigieg engaged in straw-manning, either inadvertently or on purpose, of his opponents. He engaged in cherry-picking, where he took the parts of the Bible that he liked and discarded the parts he didn't. He engaged in the ad populum fallacy of saying, hey, this is what I think everybody agrees with. He may be engaged in begging the question, maybe not. It's a little unclear because he wasn't very clear there. So that's 3 for certain fallacies. 1, maybe, maybe not, depending on how he would actually go about defending that. It may turn out to not be begging the question. It may turn out to be begging the question. But then there were a whole lot of very problematic implications and possible responses to what he was arguing, which don't really technically fall under the fallacies category. They're just very problematic, and that is, well, his type of reasoning is very, very susceptible to reductio ad absurdum, as I suggested, in several different senses, both in the sense of, well, there are people who don't technically breathe, fetuses don't technically breathe, but we would still want to consider them alive, and in this sense of, if he's a theistic evolutionist, as I would strongly suspect he is, well, then he's got a problem appealing to aspects of the Bible which he would almost certainly doubt. Furthermore, he seems to just be assuming that there's multiple valid and possible interpretations of the scripture, multiple or contradictions prevalent in it, so it's not a good source, and he just doesn't defend that. He just flatly asserts that, and that's not something that he or anybody else should be able to get away with. A very good standard principle in any type of reasoning, whether you're talking about politics, logic, philosophy, theology, or even any of the sciences, is if you're making a claim, you bear the burden to demonstrate it. So if you're going to claim there's multiple valid interpretations of Scripture, it's got contradictions. You bear the burden of proof to show that. Now, maybe he can bear that burden of proof, but he quite plainly did not, and he should. So that's 3 for sure fallacies, 1 maybe fallacy, and 2 or 3 highly problematic implications of the way Buttigieg argues for abortion that show just how bad this reasoning is. And yes, I did literally pull all of that out of a 1 or 2 minute segment of him talking about it. So, I guess, so some people might want to say I'm being a bit too nitpicky, but again, this is a guy who's running for president, and he's on top of the polls in some of the states as far as the Democratic primaries go, and we need to expect better reasoning than this from the people who are going to be our leaders. And I strongly suspect that this is just an indication that Buttigieg, despite the appearance he likes to give as a thoughtful, moderate person, he probably hasn't really thought through the implications of much of what he's saying. He probably hasn't thought through the philosophy of when life begins. Probably hasn't thought through the political philosophy of when you justify when the government intervenes and when it doesn't. Now, I've never met the guy. I've never read anything he's written, but the fact that he speaks this way strongly makes me suspect that he just hasn't ever thought about any of these things, probably because none of the journalists who interview him have ever held him to account and actually asked him to explain or justify what he thinks, which is a whole other problem that's going on in the media, which, hey, I've talked about that a bit before on this podcast. Now, if you want to know why I think abortion is very, very evil and 99% of the time it's nothing more than murder for convenience, I'm not going to rehash all those arguments here, but again, I did a whole podcast on it. Go back and listen to podcast number 15 if you want to know more about that. So that's all I have to say about how bad Buttigieg's reasoning is. Again, almost 20 minutes of stuff from him. So again, that was almost 20 minutes from just a 1 or 2 minute clip, but the sad reality is it just takes a lot more time to explain where somebody's gone wrong than it does for them to just say stupid things. It's always going to take me more time to explain to you why what you said was stupid than it was for you to say something really stupid. And I've been guilty of saying some stupid things myself too, and fortunately I've had some people in my life who have taken the time to explain to me, no, Phil, that was really, really dumb, and here's why. Okay, so now I want to share some feedback that the podcast has been getting. A couple of weeks back, I gave out a double facepalm and sigh award to Beto O'Rourke for managing to contradict himself in one sentence. I was, I'll admit, a little proud of the fact that I found that, because it's so rare that you find somebody who contradicts themselves in a single sentence. And anyhow, feedback I got from a guy named Tim A. Troutman, who's contacted me before and told me that he's a Anyhow, he wrote in and said, I would like to push back on your facepalm award. Beto is certainly wrong, but his statement is not formally contradictory. Perhaps it is a material contradiction, but that depends on the content, or namely the premises behind the statements. Given the premises that he holds, his statement was pretty reasonable. Now, his premises are very wrong, but it would seem more fitting to give him a facepalm award in the context of him defending those premises instead. An easy way to determine if something is a material contradiction and not formal is to see if you could replace the components and still find the statement contradictory. For example, we could say that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental right, but you do not have the right to kill someone, even if you think that would make you happy. This statement is formally the same as his statement, and presumably you would agree with my statement. So the problem is not so much that he should have recognized the contradiction. He does not understand it is a contradiction because he is confused on the material components. You also said that if a church did not agree to marry or recognize same-sex marriage, this is not discrimination. But it is discrimination. The important distinction to make is that discrimination is not always a bad thing. In fact, with minimal reflection, anyone can see that almost every act of discrimination is good. The problem is that in our society we have infused a lot of negative connotation into the word discrimination. But we should not defend the church by claiming that she is not discriminating. She most certainly is, and she will continue to do so whether or not the government believes she has the right. I do agree with what you were saying, but I think you should have been more precise. And another guy named Dave, who happens to be one of my uncles, also commented on the thread saying many similar things to what the concerns Tim raised there about discrimination. So I thought Tim raised some good points, so after taking a day or so to think about it and compose a response, I replied to him, And here's what I said to him. Well, you are quite right that O'Rourke did not make an explicit or formal contradiction, as if he'd said, I affirm both A and non-A at the same time and in the same sense. But it's really quite rare that anyone in the actual world will contradict themselves like that. Most of the contradictions, as Tim indicated, are buried a level or two down in the premises or the definitions that people are working with. And now, a side note, based on the way that Tim described these things, I'm assuming that you mean here by material contradiction, you don't mean that in a Hegelian or a Marxist sense, because that's a completely different thing. Hegelian or Marxist senses of contradictions are the idea that philosophical movements and ideas contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. So just because it's easy to spell it out this way. Marxist thought says that capitalism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, because as the wealth disparity rises and the inequality rises and the working classes are treated more unfairly, they're going to rise up, overthrow the capitalist system, and institute socialism or Marxism or something along those lines. And Marx actually took a lot of that from the Hegelian idea of thesis and antithesis, which is significantly more reasonable, but it's a very different thing than the type of contradiction that I think Tim's alluding to here. And if you were to Google material contradiction, you'd probably get something more along the lines of Hegelian or Marxist, but I don't think that's what Tim's talking about here, and it's not what I'm trying to talk about either. So what I'm saying here is that virtually every contradiction you'll find is an example of what Tim's called a material contradiction. That is, it's a contradiction that isn't explicit in the sense of somebody saying, that's a cat and not a cat at the same time. Rather, it's buried in the premises and definitions at work. Even the very classic example of a contradiction of a married bachelor, it fits this mold. In order for you to know that a married bachelor is a contradiction, you need to know the definitions of married and bachelor. And so the contradiction is not prima facie, it's not on the face of it, it's buried in the definitions. But because pretty much everybody is very familiar with the definitions of being married and being a bachelor, the contradiction is immediately obvious to us, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a great example of a contradiction. But it's still, I hope you can see, dependent on the definitions or premises of the things in the question. The things in question. Now, maybe a better illustration of what we're getting at here is probably something like if somebody were to claim, as actually I've had some people on the podcast claiming, that open theism and Molinism are contradictory notions. And it certainly is the case that under some interpretations of these views, they are contradictory. You go back and listen to my podcasts on this, where I talked with people about this, if you like. This is true that on some types of the views of open theism and Molism, they are contradictory. But the contradiction isn't going to be obvious if you don't know what Molinism and open theism are. It's dependent on the definitions and the ideas that are at work in those two theories. Now, likewise, I think you can probably, if you worked really, really hard and were a little bit disingenuous with what was going on, you could probably find an interpretation of Molinism and an interpretation of open theism that don't seem contradictory. I'm sure some people have worked really, really hard on that, and I'm sure some Molinists and open theists would scream, well, no, they are contradictory, because under most sensible interpretations they are. But, you do this a little differently here, you do that a little differently here, and you might be able to find a way to make them fit that doesn't seem contradictory. So, there's also, I'd say here, a type of contradiction where under some definitions and interpretations or premises, there is a contradiction. So what I'm saying here is, loosely speaking, we might say that there are three categories of contradiction at work here. And this isn't a formal philosophy. They spell it out much more explicitly and more detailed than that. This is just kind of loose and offhand. But there are obvious and explicit contradictions where somebody says something like both A and non-A. That is, both a cat and not a cat at the same time in the same sense. And those ones are immediately obvious. And virtually nobody does that ever, because it's so obvious that it's wrong. Then there are what Tim has termed material contradictions. That is, the contradiction that is buried somewhere within the definitions and premises at work. And those are the examples I gave, and those are by far the most common contradictions you're going to come across in both everyday speak and philosophy and theology and everything. Because nobody who wants to reason well is going to just come right out and explicitly state a contradiction. They'll make them. I've been guilty of that myself before, but it's usually this second one because it's buried within the definitions and premises that are at work, so it's harder to see sometimes. And then there's a third category of contradiction here, which is, we might term a possible contradiction. That is, under some interpretations of this, we see a contradiction, and under some other ones, we do not. And there I'm using Molinism and open theism as an example. I do think they're contradictory, but there probably are people who would interpret them in ways such that they are not. Now, again, responding more directly to Tim here, I think you are definitely right that O'Rourke doesn't fall into this first category, but I still want to argue that he does fall into the second one. Now, Tim is also right when he says that an easy way to determine if something is a material contradiction and not formal is to see if you could replace the components and still find the statement contradictory. What he's describing there is just a virtue of valid arguments. You can treat them kind of like a math equation at times. Now, I do want to make a note that this doesn't always work, because sometimes by changing the components, you change the nature of what's going on. So, take the Molinism and open theism example again. Change one of those to Christianity, and it changes the whole nature of what's going on there. Is Molinism contradictory with Christianity? Well, no, I don't think so. Is open theism contradictory with Christianity? Well, no, I certainly don't think so, although some people have argued I think they're mistaken in that. But, see, that's a bit of a different thing, because in changing the components like that, you're actually changing the category of what's going on. Christianity isn't in the same category as open theism or Molinism. But, see, as long as we don't change the categories like this and we're not fundamentally changing what's going on, we keep things pretty similar, then Tim's quite right that that's a good way to determine if there's a contradiction going on there. But I do still think O'Rourke is guilty of one here, and here's why. I don't think that me, Tim, O'Rourke, or anyone else actually has a fundamental right to happiness. Now, before I get a bunch of angry letters and emails in, I do think we all actually have a right to happiness, but this right is not fundamental, as it can be superseded by other things, like in Tim's example, the right of another person to their own life. For something to be fundamental, that means it is the foundation upon which all other things in at least that category rest, and thus there are not exceptions to it or other things that supersede it. So in order for the right to happiness to be fundamental, it would have to not be able to be superseded by anything else. That is, you could kill people for your own happiness if that was a fundamental right. And clearly you can't do that, therefore happiness is not a fundamental right, even though it's another type of right. So to help explain a little bit what I mean by fundamental here, as a Christian theist philosopher, I think God is the fundamental reality. There are no exceptions or things that supersede him. Reality is fundamentally God. I also think that the basic rules of logic, as best articulated by Aristotle, are the fundamentals to all of rationality and good thinking. There are no exceptions or superseding provisos. The law of contradiction is always true. Contradictory things do not exist. No exceptions or provisos. That's fundamental. So, with all respect intended to Tim, I think that when he argues we have a fundamental right to happiness unless it conflicts with somebody else's life, he's expressing a contradiction, as in order for an idea, principle, philosophy, or anything like that to be fundamental, nothing can countermand or supersede it. And this is where I argue that O'Rourke's error is. If you have a fundamental right to religious freedom, then nothing can countermand or supersede that, as it is the basis of all freedom. And I don't think you have a fundamental right to religious freedom like that, even though you do have a right to religious freedom, but it can be superseded by other things. If your religion commands you to go out and murder people, you don't have that right. So while we do have many rights, I don't think that you or I have, or anybody, has fundamental rights of much of anything at all, except perhaps maybe the right to our own thoughts, our own opinions, and a few things like that. It's very, very easy to find counterexamples to nearly everything that somebody's going to claim is a fundamental right. It's very easy to find examples of something that should supersede it, or a case where it's not going to apply, and therefore I'd say those rights aren't fundamental. Things like the right to free speech in America, the right to own and bear arms, the right to religious freedom. It's very easy to find examples where something supersedes that, so those aren't fundamental rights. But now, in Tim's case, I think he's more in the third category rather than the second. I think it's more a case where there's a way to interpret what he's saying as contradictory and a way to not interpret what he's saying as contradictory. It's very, very common, especially here in the U.S., for people to speak of fundamental rights in the way that Tim did, and I strongly suspect that when he did that, he's just not defining fundamental in the same way I just did. Rather, I think he's probably means something more like religious freedom is an extremely important right. It's one of the central aspects of American society, and so on, things like that. And in that case, if that's what he meant, then his intended meaning is not a contradiction, and this is just an example of how people commonly use language in ways that is imprecise and not philosophically precise. It's really quite possible to interpret Tim's statement, you have a fundamental right to religious freedom so long as you're not killing somebody else, without a contradiction. But it's also possible that you do interpret it as a contradiction if you're being more philosophically precise. So here we could say, maybe Tim falls in the trap, maybe he doesn't, it depends on what he means. And in this case, I think he probably means the one that's not a contradiction. Now, some people might want to hear that and want to argue that O'Rourke is in a similar category to Tim here, and I tried to allude to that a little bit when I gave O'Rourke the Facepalm and Sigh Award, but when I said, hey, let's interpret him charitably and see what we can get with here. But I'm also far less likely to interpret O'Rourke charitably than I am Tim, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, O'Rourke is a politician attempting to seize power over our lives, and thus I think we have a epistemological and moral duty to look at him with skepticism, just as we should everyone who seeks power. If somebody wants power over you, the burden is on them to prove not only that that they can exercise it wisely, but they can exercise it justly and morally, and so on and so forth. The burden isn't on me to disprove that O'Rourke is a good candidate for president. The burden is on him to prove to me that he is. And it's that way with everyone who seeks power for anything. Although obviously if you're talking about, 8-year-old who wants to be the captain of a Little League team, the burden is significantly less because there's significantly less power involved there. And second, I would say that as a politician who's seeking the presidency, O'Rourke has a duty to work through the philosophy and ontology of all these issues. That is, he has a duty to work out and think through what is the nature of rights? What is or are the foundations of American society, government, and politics? What is the ontology of all these things? Essentially, by the virtue of him seeking the president, he therefore has a duty to have a well-developed theory of government and a well-thought-out political philosophy. And yes, I know, almost no politician does, and they're all wrong for it. In O'Rourke's case, the fact that he speaks about things like this that are so important, like the problem we see in our society of religious freedom versus discrimination, in such flippant ways, that tells me he probably hasn't thought through any of this and really doesn't know very much about what he's talking about, and that's why he ends up contradicting himself in such foolish ways. And fortunately for all of us, and for America, and for people who want to actually think rationally and logically, O'Rourke had to drop out. He's no longer in the race, and I wouldn't even be talking about him anymore if it hadn't been for Tim sending in this feedback that gives us some excellent commentary and good reason to talk about the nature of contradictions and when they are and aren't applicable and various issues regarding discrimination. So I don't think Tim actually did contradict himself, even though I argue that you can't have a fundamental right like that, as I think probably when he wrote his response there, he had something very different in mind by the word fundamental than I just defined it as in a strict philosophical sense. But I'm not going to interpret O'Rourke charitably like that because he and everyone else seeking power needs to be held to a much, much higher standard than somebody who's leaving a comment on my podcast. Now, Tim also commented on what I said about discrimination, and he's got a good point here, too. If there is only one sense or type of discrimination, then he's quite right that not all of it is bad. We all attempt to discriminate between, say, good and bad philosophy. That's what I'm trying to do on the podcast here. Good and bad restaurants. That's what I do every time I go out to eat. Good and bad movies. My wife doesn't like how rigorously I discriminate between those because she says I'm ruining movies that, well, maybe they're not amazing, but they're not so bad they need to be ruined. And, and so on and so forth. And if we really only mean discrimination in one sense like that, then what we really need to be concerned about is unjust discrimination. There's nothing unjust about me discriminating between which restaurant I want to go to, between good and bad philosophy. It's actually virtuous and good to discriminate between good and bad philosophy. So the question we need to be asking is something more like, do I dislike Hume's philosophy for very good reasons, because it's often contradictory and foolish, or do I dislike it because he was Scottish and I'm prejudiced against the Scots? Now, obviously, if I dislike Hume's philosophy because I'm prejudiced, that's unjust, and unjust discrimination is something we'd want to cast down or avoid. But then when we're talking about the government, as O'Rourke was, we need to go beyond what's just unjust discrimination to unjust discrimination that is also illegal or should be illegal. For example, let's suppose I actually am prejudiced against the Scots, even though I'm not, and there's a Scottish person who runs a business in my town. Now, I never go to his business and buy anything because of my prejudice. That's unjust, and it would be immoral if I behaved that way. But it's also not illegal, and it shouldn't be illegal. We all need to be free to associate or not associate with whoever we want to, even if it is for unjust or immoral reasons. So Tim's quite right that I should have spelled this out a little more clearly, but what I'm getting at here is that, say, a church that refuses to recognize or perform same-sex weddings is not a type of discrimination that is or should be illegal. Saying that is or should be illegal would be akin to claiming that a mosque needs to hold Christian weddings or else the Muslims are immorally and illegally discriminating, which of course is ridiculous. Now, the reason why this is not the type of discrimination that we should consider illegal is that it's still perfectly possible for gay people to go get married at other churches or the local courthouse. Thus, the fact that some churches say no to same-sex marriage doesn't actually prevent anyone from exercising what is in the U.S. their legal rights. Similarly, the above example that I gave about the Scottish business, the fact that I don't go to that business doesn't prevent that person from exercising his right to own and run a business. And I think this even applies to people like O'Rourke, who want to argue that it's immoral that someone like me is against same-sex marriage. Even if it turned out that O'Rourke was right on the morality of this and I'm wrong, the fact that I think same-sex marriage is an immoral and stupid idea doesn't prevent any gay people from going and getting married, either at a church that'll do it or at the local courthouse or something like that. So it shouldn't be an illegal type of discrimination, even though in a certain sense you could say I'm discriminating between ideas that I think are good and bad, actions that I think are immoral, and so on and so forth. Now, there's another way that people have attempted to deal with this problem with discrimination, and that's to just explicitly define several different types, as I kind of alluded to here, but I didn't really do it explicitly. Several people have done that. The only example I have that comes to mind right now is Thomas Sowell, and you could look that up if you want to. So, to conclude my response to Tim here, and I went through it here on the podcast because I love it when I get feedback and love going through it, and I think it's a good exercise to go through and think about, well, what is the nature of contradictions and discrimination? These are good, important issues to think about. So I do think Tim made some good points and pointed out some areas that I really should have spelled things out more clearly. I was probably going through it a little too quickly. But I do still want to argue that O'Rourke did contradict himself in the second sense, and that it's not immoral or illegal discrimination for a church to say no to same-sex marriage. And I'd even want to argue that if you do think it's immoral discrimination, you still shouldn't think that it should be illegal, because them simply saying, no, we don't want to have a same-sex wedding, doesn't in any way prevent people who want to do that from going and doing so. Now, Tim gave another reply to my reply, but I won't go ahead and go into that. It was mostly kind of agreeing with my points and saying that he really appreciated the exchange and me taking the time to get back to him. And I really appreciated Tim writing in like that. As I said, I really enjoy engaging with people who listen to the podcast, and it gave me a good excuse to spend all this time talking about, well, what is a contradiction and the various types of discrimination and things along those lines. Now, another person who wrote in is a guy named Fred Heiberg, and he said, "Hey Phil, I just wanted to say I love your series on the problem of divine foreknowledge. I'm just finishing up the last episode of the series. I was raised in a very staunch Reformed church and was told it was the only view that glorified God, while all the other views glorified man. And imagine that. Over the years of listening to hours of William Lane Craig and others, I've become more aware of the other views. I'm probably more on the Molinist side of things, but I recognize it has problems. But then again, so does every view. Regardless, this series was great. If it interests you, I think a good topic would be Old Testament violence. There seems to be a range of views on that as well. But then again, it's probably more a theological than a philosophical topic. Always the best. Keep freely choosing to drink your coffee. Well, Fred, I most certainly will keep freely choosing to drink coffee. Although, unfortunately, I've had an incident recently where I couldn't go to sleep all night, and my wife convinced me it's because I was drinking coffee too late in the afternoon. I'm apparently getting too old to drink it whenever I want, so I've got to move my free choice of coffee up in the day, unfortunately. That's unfortunate. So the response I sent to Fred here is, I said, hey, thanks, I really appreciated that. I also find myself sympathetic to Molinism, but as you said, it does seem to have some problems. After doing the whole series, the only view I came away somewhat less sympathetic to is the Calvinistic/Reform view, as it seems to me it does not glorify God, but makes it unjust. That is, even though many Calvinists are very, very decent people, I'm sure some of them are much better Christians and better followers of Christ than I am, the view does seem to have some pretty negative consequences. And I also think that doing something on Old Testament violence is a good idea. It's a pretty common objection that you're going to hear people make to Christianity. I already kind of indirectly looked at that when I was talking about inerrancy, when I referenced how Greg Boyd deals with that in his book, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, through what he termed a crucifixion hermeneutic. You can go back and listen to the episode on inerrancy if you really want to know that, although it wasn't the focus of that episode. I used how Boyd talks about that issue as an example. And I also know that the philosopher Paul Copan has actually wrote a whole book about this problem, so maybe I'll look into seeing if I could get one or both of them on. I'm definitely going to put this idea in my list of possible topics and see if that's something I can work on. So then I just, again, thanked Fred for writing in and the feedback, and that I also told him that tomorrow I was going to freely have a cup of coffee in his honor. So that's some of the feedback I've been getting, as I really, really enjoy getting feedback, especially if it's feedback like Tim did, where it's pushing back and giving me critiques and constructive criticism, saying, hey, I think you might have missed the point here, and here's why, because that's how good philosophy is done. If I say something where you're like, no, I don't quite agree, I think you missed the mark here, and I can tell you why, write in and tell me no, because I'm never going to learn any better if somebody doesn't come along and say, you're wrong and here's why. And that's why I really appreciated Tim's feedback there. Okay, so at the start of this episode, I promised you not one, but two little segments on Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy. So the first one is actually one that I'd originally intended to put out last week when I was trying to explain why evolution is very unlikely to have produced the moral systems that we human beings have. But I just kind of ran out of time. There was a lot of ground to cover there. And so the gist of this cartoon is it's a 5-panel comic, and Calvin and Hobbes would often do story sequences over the course of many comics, and this is one from one of those where it's coming up on Christmas time, and Calvin is debating with his tiger about how good he may have to be in order for Santa to bring him presents. And at the same time, he's struggling to be good because he really wants to throw a snowball at the little girl who lives in his neighborhood named Susie. And so he's plotting this back and forth. He's got a snowball all trying to think about, well, what if I just throw it at her and deliberately miss? Is that good? Is that bad, or is that good enough? And Hobbes is simultaneously egging him on and playing devil's advocate with him. And so this segment starts where Susie has actually seen him plotting to throw a snowball at him, and so she comes by. While he's distracted, debating the morals of this with his stuffed tiger, she comes by and plops him in the face with a snowball, saying, plotting to hit me with a snowball, well here, and she throws one right in his face. And the next panel shows Susie running off, and Calvin with snow covered over his face, making a snowball, saying, see that, she hit me first. Now if I hit her, it's justified. Ha ha ha, sweet revenge, oh boy, oh boy. And then he's still covered with snow, about to throw the snowball, and Hobbes says to him, or you could prove to Santa how good you are. The next panel shows Calvin covered with snow, stopping to consider this, and Hobbes saying, it's your big chance. The last panel shows Calvin screaming at the top of his lungs, I don't want to be this good. And I think that's a very good demonstration of Paul's paradox in the morality of a 6-year-old. He wants to be good enough to get the rewards, but he wants to take his revenge and be a little bad too. And that's the same thing we all struggle with, whether we're a 6-year-old trying to throw a snowball or a greedy adult trying to wonder how much we can get away with stealing where we want to get ahead, but we don't want to get caught, and so on and so forth. You can think of every other possible example. Paul's paradox is all over in all of morality, and this is why one of the reasons why Calvin and Hobbes is so brilliant. You get that very odd principle of morality demonstrated in a 5-panel comic about kids throwing snowballs at each other. Okay, and the second one I'm doing here is, this one's very, very simple. Calvin is sitting there in school. He's looking at a test, and the test says 2 plus 7 equals blank. And Calvin writes in, I cannot answer this question as it is against my religious principles. Third panel shows him picking up the paper, looking at it with his tongue out, considering it. Last panel shows him setting the paper down on the desk, saying, it's worth a shot. And this one I think is particularly relevant to the feedback and back and forth Tim and I were having, because, well, I would say that's probably a pretty inappropriate application of religious freedom to apply it to math there. And the primary reason is that it's perfectly obvious that when a 6-year-old answers that, it has nothing to do with religious freedom. It has to do with him being lazy, not wanting to study, not enjoying school, and many other things. Although in this case, I would have to say, I'd want to give points to the kid for being clever enough to try to give something like that a try. I've heard it said by psychologists and psychiatrists and people who study childhood development that one of the ways you can actually see if a child is clever and motivated is they're going to push at the edges of the systems they're in. They're going to push at you as a parent to see how much they can get away with before you push back. They're going to push at the school to see how much they can get away with before the school pushes back, and so on and so forth. They're, so to speak, testing the limits, not because they're jerks, but because one of the ways you understand the various systems you're in is test the limits. You learn how far is too far by testing the limits. And so that's, in some senses at least, it might be that Calvin's actually pretty clever here, and he's testing the limits and trying all kinds of different category approaches to math to see what fits, what doesn't, what's acceptable, and what doesn't. So maybe he'll turn out to be a great philosopher one day who's a skeptic like Socrates and tests all these kind of things. So mostly I did this one because I think it's funny and it's applicable, but there is some implications there about kids testing limits and mixing categories before they understand how all the categories work in the world, and that when kids do that, that's actually a sign that they're trying to learn and think things through. When adults do it, it's usually a sign that they haven't learned and aren't thinking things through. So that's the extent of this week's episode. As I said at the beginning, all segments of Facepalm and Sigh Award, feedback segment, and then Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy, 2 of them. I haven't done a podcast like this before of all segments, so just let me know what you think about the Facepalm and Sigh Award, or some of the feedback and discussion I had with Tim or Fred, and any other things you like or don't like. Write and let me know. I always appreciate the feedback. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminelifewithphil@gmail.com, or reach out to me on the Facebook group I started for the page called The Examine Life with Phil. Just do a search for it and you'll find it pretty easy. I also try and post fun and interesting stuff on there periodically other than the podcast. And if you enjoy the podcast, by all means, please share it on your social media. Even if you have to, share it on Twitter, or give it a like and review on whatever podcast app you use. Get it out to more people, that kind of thing. And as always, thanks for listening. And this week, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And I'll be back again next week. Thanks so much.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.